The effects of the Opolossi adventure were with me for a long time. To Rudy I wrote that I had experienced atrocious and terrible things, but where need was greatest, God's help was closest. Apart from a few tiny splinters in my hands, that today I can no longer remember, I told him that I had remained unscathed. Our chaps had said that the battles of the winter had not been as bad as those terrible days. The return from Gzhatsk to St. Avold took us 8 days. I can remember several stops that lasted many hours. First in Vyazma, then in Molodechno and Dunaburg. Only from Warsaw were regular trains running, but we had to change trains many times. In Berlin, we arrived at the Silesian station and had to go to the Zoo station. From there, a train went to Metz. Our destination was St. Avold, where we were given a few days' leave. From my correspondence, I note that I must have visited my father in Vienna. He was in the reserve military hospital there, on the Rosenhügel. It was only while in the position at Gzhatsk that I had found out he had had a surprise move to Russia. During the course of the advance in the south, which then led on into the Caucasus and to Stalingrad, his military hospital group had got as far as Stalino and Artemovsk in the eastern Ukraine. We suffered considerable casualties in the offensive. They led to the associated overload on the resources of the dressing stations, the field and main military hospitals. It also led to the overwork of the medical officers and other medical unit staff. At the age of 50, in a state of nervous exhaustion, he himself had to be taken into hospital, but he was able to tell of his good fortune that he was not sent back to service behind the lines on the Eastern Front. Instead, he was sent to the west, to Cambrai. On the 13th of September 1942, I was back in St. Avold. From there, we 3 active officer cadets, Henschel, Popovsky and I, were sent to Metz for a preparatory course for War College. About 60 reserve officer candidates were assembled there for a revision of the ABC, as I wrote home. Once again, it was a matter of cleaning our boots and belts. Apart from the danger of being killed, life in the field, I said, was far better. I asked Mother to send me 50 marks because we were hungry and were being woefully shooed about. In the evening, we went into the town to eat unrationed standard meals in the inns. The course was supposed to last until the 9th of October, and the course at the War College to begin on the 12th of October, but we still did not know to which school we would be sent. On the 29th of September, I asked Mother to send immediately, and by registered post, my certificate of Aryan ancestry and my 5th form German essay exercise book. Father sent me a textbook on stenography on which I worked from time to time. At the grammar school I had not taken that option so as not to further increase my workload. The course in Metz gradually petered out at the beginning of October. In the mornings we were supposed to undertake duty with a company, but since no one is bothered, we lie in really late in the morning and then go into town. We 3 from Regiment 7 were ordered to School 1 for probationary officers of infantry in Dresden. It was the War College for the active junior infantry officers, and could be found in Neustadt under the really civilian-sounding address of 11 Marion Alley. I arrived early on the 12th of October, and as the first to arrive had rung them up. Then in the afternoon I went out by tram to the War College. I did not meet the prescribed requirement of at least 2 months' probation at the front, so at first it seemed doubtful whether I would be accepted. It was with relief that I noted the positive decision. Part of that was doubtless due to the fact that the regiment, which knew what the entry requirements were, had sent me there nevertheless. It was a pleasant surprise for Popovsky and me that almost half the course participants and a large part of the teaching personnel were Southern Germans. I even found a room with Popovsky. In fact, it was an apartment. The rooms, each provided for 4 men, consisted of bedrooms and living rooms. As it was wartime, by means of double beds, they were occupied by twice the normal complement of men. So there were 8 of us. As well as the 2 of us, there were 6 more Gebirgsjäger, among whom we immediately felt at home. I can still remember Ernst Lauder from Kapfenberg, Hubert Melcher from Obdach, Adolf Aschauer from Geusen, Dauth from Munich, Jacobi from Konstanz, and Zielinski from Stettin. The man from Stettin had reported to the mountain troops for the same sort of reasons that many southern Germans and Austrians went into the navy. At the War College I also met Boyle from Stockerau, the brother of one of Rudy's classmates, and my fellow pupil from Sonneberg, Klaus Nitzer. Once again, I wrote urgently for my Arya Nachweis because non-Aryans, covering those who were up to 1/4 Jewish, were not allowed to become officers. Translators note, the certificate of Aryan ancestry required under the National Socialist racial laws before an individual could be admitted to many institutions. The accommodation was unbelievably comfortable. We had white bedclothes, running water in the bedroom, and the rooms were cleaned by cleaning ladies. I wrote that the War College was the best time I had had as a soldier so far. It required not only physical, but also mental and spiritual qualities. The superiors, all officers, were selected men. The head of the inspection was a Hauptmann from Infantry Regiment 19 Munich, the group officer Oberleutnant Malzahn. I also recall the tactics teacher, Major Rausen from Infantry Regiment 49 Breslau. The inspection corresponded to a company, the group to a platoon. The aim of the course was to train us to become platoon commanders, the normal function of a lieutenant. The exercises took place on the famous Dresden troop training ground, the Heller. We had little free time. What little time I could spare I spent with my relatives, mainly with Uncle Rudolf and Aunt Hannie Lerner. At that time Rudolf had much to do. He was working on commissions for the memorial to Richthofen, the fighter pilot, at the Invalidenfriedhof in Berlin. He worked too on figures for the Dresden Opera and the Reich War Ministry. In our room we often had a piano, to which the Styrians, Ernst Lauder and Hubert Melcher from Gebirgsjäger Regiment 28, especially contributed. Their Ersatz troop unit was at that time in Marburg on the Drau. A short time previously they had heard a production there of Verdi's Traviata. Ernie Lauder was really taken with the champagne aria and sang over and over again, "Up, drink in thirsty draughts from the glass that beauty presents to you." The two of them teased each other with the amatory adventures they had had in Marburg. It emerged that Ernie had once spent the conclusion of such an evening in the Marburg Municipal Park. He had got so hot that in no time he had taken off at least his field tunic as well as his belt. Ernst Lauder was killed in April 1944. Hubert Melcher lost a leg. Adolf Aschauer survived the war in one piece. Once after the war I looked him up in the Racing-Mühle in Geusen, his home. Ernst Lauder's father at one time entered into correspondence with me, and I met him in Schweidnitz. He was at the time on the staff of Heeresgruppe Süd with Feldmarschall Kesselring, and he told me of one absurd order from the Führer. This order required that the sarcophagus of the Hohenstaufen Emperor Friedrich II be brought back with the army on the evacuation of Sicily. However, Kesselring refused the order on the grounds that he needed every cubic metre of ship for troops and ammunition. The star of our group was Arnold Suppan, a smart Kärntner with brown hair and brown eyes. He already held the Iron Cross First Class and the silver Infanteriesturmabzeichen, infantry assault badge. The Gebirgsjäger told a lot about the Murmansk front from which they came, about the bright summer nights and the dark winter days in the Arctic Circle. The weeks passed quickly, and in the middle of November we heard the great news that the course would finish on the 16th of December. The best group of students, to which I too belonged, would be promoted on the 1st of December to Fahnenjunker Feldwebel. The majority of the candidates were handed out their uniform chits. My request to Rudi was to the effect that he should obtain a sword, an officer's belt and a holster, because it looked as if there were not any in Dresden. In actual fact, a sword was never required. In any event, I would only have been able to wear it on very few occasions. My first officer's uniform I had made by Uncle Rudolph's tailor. He rejoiced in the cosy name of Trautwetter. For my overcoat and the second uniform I waited until my Christmas leave. I had them made at Spleinach in the Theobaldgasse by the tailor of the Steinbach family. The tunic was of better material, and the overcoat displayed all the skill of a Viennese Bohemian tailor. Our instructor, Oberleutnant Malzahn, professed himself to be very satisfied with us from the Ostmark. On the occasion of our promotion to Feldwebel, he told us the notes he had made on our assessment. He found me, among other things, very intelligent. I had never before been praised in that way. It certainly said a lot for his judgment. He himself was of above-average intelligence and culture, and in addition showed us a lot of what it means to live like an officer. Our promotion to lieutenant was to take place on the 12th of December. I announced that I would be arriving home on the 16th of December, a Wednesday. I asked Rudi to collect me, and I ordered a celebration meal of whatever mother wanted to rustle up. Before then, however, we had the trip to Berlin. There, in accordance with tradition, The Führer was to speak to us in the Sportpalast. The entire War College marched from the Anhalt station. We were divided into several groups and went by different routes. On one, we passed through a quarter of Berlin, which showed city slums that shocked us. The event took place in the Sportpalast. Several thousand young officers were assembled there. At first, there was a long wait for Adolf Hitler. After some time, it was announced that, in Hitler's place, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring would speak to us. After another long wait, Göring came hurrying in. He gave the impression that he was under severe psychological pressure, which the content of his address underscored. We later found out that it was on that very day that the tragedy of Stalingrad began to loom. It explained why Hitler had not come, and made it disconcertingly clear why Göring praised the death of the Spartans at Thermopylae under their king Leonidas. "Wanderer, should you come to Sparta, tell them there that you have seen us lying dead as the law ordained." The Reichsmarschall simply substituted the word duty for the word law and almost punched it at us. As duty ordained, as duty ordained. At the end of his address, we were immediately marched off to the station and straight away began our return journey to Dresden. It had been the previous day when the names of those who had been promoted were read out in the gym. It began with the members of Infantry Regiment 1, Königsberg, and ended with those in the Gebirgsjäger Regiment who were last in the numerical series. We from Regiment 7, in alphabetical order, were Henschel, Popovsky and Scheidebauer. We soon had our turn. Afterwards, Wiggle and I dozed off in a half-sleep of emotions of release and tiredness. The night before, following an order given by our Lieutenant Riedel, we had hoisted the white flag on the chimney of the boiler house. To accomplish that, one of our bed sheets had to be brought along. We had to cobble together something to raise it, and the 20-metre-high chimney had to be scaled. Since you could climb the chimney on iron rungs on its inside wall, it presented not too much difficulty, but nevertheless it required some courage. It was Popovsky who volunteered to take up the duties of the climbing party, and not one of the Gebirgsjäger. It might be imagined that the task would fall more easily to them because of the arm of the service they were in. Oberleutnant Malzahn was pleased that his group, the 12th group in the 3rd inspection, had carried out the task. With my promotion to lieutenant, I was then, to a certain extent, grown up. I was not then 19, and would not come of age for a long time. I had already been an Unteroffizier, but then I was capable of supporting myself, and was in receipt of a salary with my own account at the Stockerau Savings Bank. At that time, a lieutenant's salary was 220 Reichsmarks per month. It was a considerable sum for a grammar school boy, but also for a soldier who had to live only on his service pay, and that meant from his additional front-line allowance. In any event, the Frey station was guaranteed. It guaranteed a barracks roof over your head, and military rations that were more or less adequate and digestible for a young stomach. As well as our salary, we got a one-off clothing payment, the enormous amount of 750 Reichsmarks. My kind Aunt Lotta had given me an additional 50 Reichsmarks for my Equipierung, an expression she used from the old Imperial Army. In a letter to Mother she wrote about it and told her, quite touched, that I looked like a young nobleman. Father, with great seriousness, had written me the following: "Now you have your own independent profession. This gives you the authority to make your own independent decisions in forming your future life. I most fervently wish you one thing, that it will always be given to you to make use of this freedom in a wise and appropriate way. A great deal is demanded of you for your age. I also hope just as fervently that in the future you may also not disdain the advice of your parents. Of course, the plans and thoughts of parents can also be wrong, and we must leave it in the hands of God, to whom, of all those involved, he grants the best thought. From my experience, however, I can tell you one thing, that in my life something has always gone awry whenever I forgot, from time to time, to pray regularly. May this never happen to you, especially in these present times that will bring many serious dangers for you. Don't forget to pray, and to pray for better days. Perhaps in some way you will have to go through again the whole process of choosing and preparing for a career. I do wish that you might be spared that, but God alone knows. My blessing and prayers will always be with you." The Christmas leave passed off harmoniously, even if the atmosphere was really not Christmas-like. There was no snow on the ground. I had missed Father. He had been given a short period of special leave from his post because his brother, my uncle Eric, had been killed in action on the 29th of November by Lake Ilmen in the northern sector of the Russian front. Thus he was able to visit his brother's widow, Annalisa. She was in Eisting, near Schwertberg, with her 3 small children, Thea, Harold and Uta. He also visited his mother, who lived in Hadersdorf-Weidlingau. I got angry about grumbling townspeople who were losing nothing, and from whose families no one had joined up, but who still grumbled about the situation. From my class, Iwan Wagner, who was also an infantry lieutenant, as well as Erhard Hammeter and Friedel Schiffmann, both Fähnricher in the Navy, were all on leave. With Friedel Schiffmann's sister Heidi, I struck up a fleeting and short-lived friendship. However, by the summer Herta had turned away from me. Admittedly, I visited the Henk house. When I was visiting one afternoon, I left my officer's cap, overcoat and dagger in the hall. That conman Uvald took possession of the uniform and had his photograph taken, dressed in it, in his father's studio. The course at the War College was followed by a company commander's course at the infantry school in Döberitz near Berlin. I arrived there after New Year. Popovsky and I were given a double room together in the bleak barracks. There, in contrast to the luxurious conditions in Dresden, unfavourable conditions prevailed. The barracks were unheated and therefore perishing cold. The food was terribly little, bad and cold. At night we had to sleep in our underwear, pullovers and training kit, or else the cold would have done you in. We were allowed to go to Berlin only on Saturdays and Sundays. I immediately suffered a bout of angina, which when I was young I got almost every winter. On my birthday, the 13th of January 1943, which I designated as the saddest in my life up till then, while in a foul mood I wrote a letter to Rudy. Like me, he wanted to become an active officer. I asked him whether he had sent off his application, because if not, he should think it over very carefully. I said that at such a young age, one could not always make 100% correct decisions, that is, decisions that affected one's entire life. I told him there was nothing worse than a life that was ruined by choosing the wrong profession. I said there was one thing he had to give particular thought to, something that I unfortunately had realized too late, and that was the mostly spiritual hollowness and emptiness of the service. For that reason, I doubted whether the profession would satisfy my brother. With me this was, I confessed, not the case, and perhaps after the war I would still change professions in some way. Aunt Lily, father's eldest sister, had at that time been living in Berlin with her family. Uncle Leopold Pohl was a clergyman in the Neukölln area of the city. In fact, I turned up at their house, to the horror of my mother. My parents had quarrelled with the Pohls over grandmother. However, I was cordially welcomed, and they were obviously glad I had taken the step, especially as the argument had been Uncle Pohl's fault. Against mother's reproaches I justified myself, not very seriously, by saying that it was because of our need for heating that I had been directed to them, but also said that Uncle Pohl had lent me an immersion heater and had offered an electric heating stove. I said that I would therefore prefer if they began to get along together again, even if only under the motto of coals of fire. In actual fact, the contact with my relatives was a gain for me, since I could spend the night there from Saturday to Sunday. One Saturday, I heard in the Neukölln Parish Hall the lecture of a Rostock University professor on the subject of the Johannine testimony to Christ. The lecture took place in the air raid shelter because of a British air raid. We felt like the first Christians in the catacombs in Rome. During the lecture, the anti-aircraft shells were crashing outside, and there was a hail of shrapnel on the roofs. The following Sunday I was at the service in Uncle Pohl's church. After a long absence, it was spiritually edifying for me. When the course finished at the beginning of April 1943, we got 14 days leave. After that, Popovsky and I had to report on the 15th of April to the Ersatz unit, Grenadier Ersatz Battalion 7, in Schweidnitz, Silesia. The Silesian Ersatz Army Corps had a few months earlier been moved back from Lorraine and Alsace to the home Gare Risons in Silesia. We then came for the first time into the place that had been talked about by our comrades. We believed that from then on, and even after the war, the place would be our home. Schweidnitz was called the Potsdam of Silesia. Before the war it housed the Staff, the 1st and the 3rd Battalion of Infanterie Regiment 7, the Staff and the 1st and 2nd Abteilungen of Artillery Regiment 28, a medical unit, district military command, military records office and army ancillary office. Schweidnitz was the Stadtkreis and Kreisstadt in Lower Silesia, principal seat of the principality of the same name. It lies in a fertile valley between Zobten and the Eulengebirge. The city has 2 Protestant and 2 Catholic churches, among them the Pfarrkirche, founded in 1330 by Duke Bolko II. It has the highest, 103 atem tower in Silesia, with a triple crest, 1613. There is a synagogue and an old town hall with a famous cellar and various monuments. Economic activity comprised the manufacture of electricity meters, machines, furniture, gloves, tools, terracotta and pottery ware, feather edging materials, vehicles, cigars, needles, paper and paper goods, bricks, iron casting and textiles. Long since famous was also the beer brewery, Schweidnitzer Schöps. In Addition, the city possessed a chamber of commerce and a Reichsbank office. There were 2 grammar schools, a theological institute, an agricultural winter school, 2 orphanages, an educational institute, a theatre, and an archive. It was the seat of a district court, a magistrates' court, a Landkreis administrative office, a motorsport school, and several technical schools. The early fortifications were removed in 1868 and transformed into beautiful parks. The Neptune Well, 4 market wells and a Neopomuk column of 1718, enlivened the picture presented by the city. The residential houses originated in part from the 18th century. Of the royal castle, only the Renaissance portal of 1537 was retained. The town of Schweidnitz was founded during the first half of the 13th century as a town laid out on a grid pattern between 2 roads. In 1260, it was granted its town charter. It was the residence of the first Piaston and an important festival ground in Silesia. In the later Middle Ages, Schweidnitz developed into the second largest trading city after Breslau. The Principality of Schweidnitz was founded in 1291 and joined with Jauer in 1326. Through the marriage of the heiress Anna with Kaiser Karl IV, it passed in 1368–69 to the Crown of Bohemia. In 1526 it went to the Habsburgs, and in 1742 to Prussia. In 1427, Schweidnitz was besieged in vain by the Hussites. In the 30 Years' War, 1642, it was destroyed by the Swedes under Torstensson. In 1747, it was taken by the Prussians and developed as a fortress. In 1761, it fell once more by trickery into the hands of the Austrians. Then it was retaken in 1762 by the Prussians, after a stubborn defence, remained under Prussian control, and was significantly reinforced by 4 forts. In 1807, the French took possession of them and razed the outworks to the ground. In 1816, after the fall of Napoleon, they were rebuilt, but completely flattened again in 1867. According to the census of the 17th of May 1939, Schweidnitz had 39,100 mostly Protestant inhabitants. According to the regimental history, that was the past of Schweidnitz. The officers' accommodation in the barracks was insufficient. Therefore, many officers were quartered in hotels. Popovsky and I had a room in the Hindenburg Hof, evidently the first house to hand. It was next to the railway station. The square in front had a small park, onto which we looked down from our first-floor room. As far as work went, there was not much to do. We were simply waiting for our marching orders. After Popovsky left on the 29th of April, I felt a bit lonely. I became accustomed to the feeling. But I soon found a few good comrades. One was a chap from Linz, one was from Franzensbad in Bohemia, and there was a Feldwebel officer candidate. He was a clergyman in the confessional church and at 40 years old was waiting for his promotion to lieutenant. From a letter to father, I find that I gave him the Stalingrad letter to read and copy out. That was the shocking letter of a clergyman to his congregation who had remained in Stalingrad. I still have the copy. In the same letter I asked father urgently for cigarettes. Mother still kept her cigarette ration cards Bot BV. That is zur besonderen Verfügung, for special use. With cigarettes she could probably obtain food or could meet other obligations on which she depended. The food in the barracks was frugal. Once I succeeded, on a 40-kilometre march, in getting into a village inn and in eating there, naturally for nothing. That is, without having to hand over any Reichsmarks, Eierspeis, or Eröpfelschmarrn. I remember my conversation with the landlady, who thought I was from Schweidnitz. As a result of a musical ear, I could get the Lower Silesian accent very well. She was amazed when I told her that I came from the Vienna area. On such marches through the countryside around Schweidnitz, I often had leisure to indulge in my thoughts. From Breslau, Silesia, in 1813, the War of Liberation began against Napoleon. King Friedrich Wilhelm III had founded the Iron Cross. The simply styled decoration can be traced back to a design by Schinkel, the brilliant Berlin architect. Few people know of that connection. During my time in Schweidnitz, I found out that the Zobten had played a similar role to the Wartburg, and that the students of Breslau had once made pilgrimages there. As in St. Avold and Merschingen, in the buildings of the barracks in Schweidnitz, in passages and over doors, there hung the various coats of arms of the places of Lower and Upper Silesia. It meant that in every place a piece of the fatherland should be looking down on you. The Haus Vaterland in Berlin was a large room in that gigantic establishment dedicated to every German region. There was a similar one in our barracks for the Silesian homeland and its sons. The fact that the character of the Wehrmacht was based on the wider concept of Greater Germany had at least loosened a little the principle of local allegiance. It had by no means got rid of it. After all, I then knew what Schweidnitz was like and how our regiment belonged there in peacetime. It was, as the old soldier's song says, my real home. The wait for my marching orders did not, thank God, last much longer. I was glad when it was time and I could set off via Breslau to Minsk. There I had to report to the Führer Reserve of Army Section Centre. On that journey to Russia, I did not have a goal in the same way as I had had the year before. I did not have the prospect of being sent on a course after a few months. My real probation at the front was just beginning, and all the more important since I was then an officer. Strangely, I did not think of the possibility of being wounded. A Heimatschuss, that is, wound necessitating evacuation home, could bring the coming experience on the front line to a speedy end. In the First World War, the Austrians had called it a 1,000 Gulden Schuss. It was more as if I felt myself travelling to meet an uncertain future. The recollection of Upolosi joined itself to that feeling. It was a kind of fear of being tested that weighed upon my spirits. We soon got to Bialystok and Stolpce, formerly Polish border crossings. With me in the compartment of the leave train returning to the front were sitting a senior MO and 2 paymasters. The MO was going to a military hospital. The 2 paymasters were in other lines of communication posts. The gentlemen were carrying much more luggage than I. I only had my miserable Wehrmacht haversack. Dawn broke and the train crawled at about 30 kilometers per hour through a region where there was the threat of partisans. Suddenly, an explosion shook me out of my doze, and the train lurched to a halt. It threw me off the seat on which I had been stretched out. The senior MO's case fell out of the luggage rack and hit me on the back of the neck. From outside could be heard the crack of rifles. Bullets crashed through the walls and the windows of the carriage. In the train, there was considerable excitement. The people from behind the lines reacted with panic. One paymaster fired with his 6.35 pistol through the closed window. I spoke to him and asked him to be sensible. Then I got out of the carriage and jumped into the ditch beside the tracks. I waited under cover until the rifle fire had ceased. It could have only been a few partisans who had been firing, but the damage was considerable. The empty carriage pushed in front of the locomotive, and the locomotive itself had been blown off the tracks. The forward half of the first of the long express carriages had been compressed as if it had been made of plywood. There were dead and wounded. Hours later, a fully manned handcar came from the next post up the line. In the morning, we were at last able to continue our journey. Meanwhile, the cause of the explosion had been discovered. The Russian improvisers had managed, by means of a much cobbled-together wire, to detonate an obviously homemade mine placed under the track. Then they had made off, not without first having put the fear of God into a couple of travelling paymasters with a bit of rifle fire. That experience caused me, at least for the next 20 years, not to get into the first carriage of a passenger train. From Minsk, the journey went on to Vyazma. There the line ended. Kshatsk, after the Buffalo withdrawal movement in the spring, was no longer in German hands. I had to continue on towards Spasdemensk and get off in Yelnya. Many houses had been destroyed. Only a few remained intact and were the distinguishing characteristics of that village in the lines of communication. The Soldatenheim was housed in the one single-story building. The next day a vehicle was to travel to the division. So I reserved a straw mattress for myself as the last soft bed before I arrived at the front. Then I visited the overcrowded frontline cinema to see The Judge of Zalamea. The film had not finished when suddenly there was the roar of enemy aircraft. While bombs were already falling round about, the cinema was hurriedly evacuated and everyone dived into the cellar. Experience teaches that it is a good sign if you can hear the whistle of the bombs, because then they explode further away. But in those moments it was poor consolation. There remained the dreadful feeling of having to crouch in the overcrowded cellar without being able to do anything. Getting on for 150 Lanza were together in that one room of about 70 square meters. The ceiling was supported by only one column. More and more bombs whistled and exploded. I was already considering whether I should get out into the open in one of the pauses between two waves of the bombing. Then a Feldgendarme from the division spoke to me and suggested that I run across with him to the Feldgendarmerie bunker. He had recognized me as being from the 7th by the white tabs on my epaulets. We ran off straight away, and we were both glad to have escaped the cage down there. The air raid carried on until 1 a.m., but claimed only a few victims. Above all, the direct hit on the cinema that we had feared did not happen. On the 23rd of May, I had set off from Schweidnitz, and after 2 eventful days and nights had arrived with my company. I had travelled with the Feldpost vehicle from Jelnya to the divisional command post at Alexandrino. The main dressing station was there and was working at full pressure. A battalion from 461, our sister regiment, had the previous night carried out an assault operation in which half the battalion had been lost. The road forward continued past scented meadows and shining silver birch, and over long, carefully laid corduroy roads. In the evening I at last arrived at the front line where, compared with the adventures of the journey, peace reigned. On the 25th of May I wrote to Father that my welcome to the regiment had been cordial and very nice. I had already met many people I knew. The quiet in our positions was doing me good. I was quite tense. Only now and then was there individual fire from artillery or mortars. But soon, I said, I would have got used to life at the front, and the necessary calm would return. I thanked Father that he and Mother had taught me to make the right, true Christian faith part of my life, because its true value is best learned at the front. I said that I was really helped by the New Testament that Father had given to me. He had written the dedication to me from Psalm 90 verse 10. 1,000 shall fall beside thee, and 10,000 at thy right hand, but it shall not come nigh thee. Therefore I wrote I was completely confident. God would see that all was well. Our company commander was Oberleutnant Schorsch Henschel from Upper Silesia. Kompanietruppenführer was Oberfeldwebel Taliger from Troppau. Both were reservists, and as early as 1942 had been awarded the German Cross in gold. My comrades Walter Henschel and Ludwig Popovsky were platoon commanders in the 11th and 7th companies, and I was platoon commander in the 10th. The length of the trenches in the company sector was 1 kilometre. The right-hand edge was formed by the post road in the village of Ivanovo. Only charred beams and remnants of walls were left of the few remaining houses. 2 platoons of the company were in the trenches in the main line of resistance. The 3rd was in front of them on outpost sentry duty. The distance of the enemy from our sector was 1,800 metres. The outpost sentries were 800 metres in front of our main line of resistance. That was how the notional line between the muzzles of the most forward rifles was defined. The Russians now and again fired a shell from their mortar, or a Ratschbum. Ratschbum was the name we gave to the light Russian infantry gun, an anti-tank gun that fired directly at its target, so that the sound of firing and that of impact followed in quick succession. It was a sound described by the word Ratschbum. The mood of the men was excellent. Winter was past and they had survived the retreat. The awareness of a solid superiority was beginning to root itself once again. We can hold out in a war like this for years, they felt. Only the 2nd Battalion had participated in the Upolicy adventure, but not the 3rd, in which I then was. Frivolously, I had taken my gold pocket watch with me into the field. I carried it in an aluminium container that had a cellophane pane on one side, through which you could see the watch face. But every time it was difficult to get it out of the little pocket, sewn into the waistband on the right next the button. Since I could get a waterproof service wristwatch with luminous figures on a black background, I ventured to send the pocket watch home. It actually arrived. That was by no means certain, for in spite of draconian punishments, there were many instances of theft. Even the Feldpost was not proof against thieves. It was the watch that I got as a confirmation present from Rudolf Lerner. It has been for many years on the writing desk in Thussi's ordination room. One day the divisional commander, General Lieutenant Melzer, toured the positions. He was satisfied with the state they were in, but he reproved me since he believed I was not wearing a collar sash. Actually, I did not have one, but instead had a beautiful purple silk scarf. However, in order not to be bawled out for wearing it, I had pushed it under my collar. To wear such neckerchiefs in the garrison would have been unthinkable, but here in the field the superiors turned a blind eye. The fact that the general had caught me out irritated me for quite some time. However, it was a peaceful day with glowing sunshine that prompted me to sunbathe on the grassy, sloping back of the bunker. But soon that was too insecure, because I feared I might fall asleep. If a shell had struck, I would have been lying out in the open without cover. Another day the Russians, instead of disturbing us with shells, fired all their infantry weapons for a quarter of an hour, as if possessed, for no apparent reason. The fire could not hurt us in the cover of the bunker or in the trenches, but there was an uninterrupted chirping, buzzing and whistling, and, because no shells were exploding, it was a particularly unique sound. When the firing began, the company commander's putzer, that is Batman, was outside his bunker and was wounded in the foot just as he was having a pee. In such trench warfare, which in itself was quiet, there was the institution of the Zugführer vom Dienst. When it was my turn at night, I had to inspect the entire company sector and the outpost sentries. I had to check the links between our company and the neighbouring companies. Those excursions out in front of the line were exciting, and not without danger. At any moment you could bump into a Russian reconnaissance patrol. On dark nights it was said to have happened that the Ivans captured Lanza by throwing a blanket over their head. As far as possible you had to tread quietly, often stopping and listening. An additional task was assigned to me. I had to develop lectures for military moral support on the basis of materials supplied to me. Then I had to go round lecturing from bunker to bunker. The subjects were 1. The soldier and his political mission in the East. 2. The soldier and the woman of a different race. 3. The Feldpost letter A weapon. Considering that in the other battalions of the regiment the lectures were considered to be the task of a Hauptmann, whereas I, as a mere lieutenant, had been selected to deliver them, I felt proud. Only you would have to tear yourself apart, I wrote on the 3rd of July to my mother. Monotony and relative peace were a breeding ground of sometimes endless rumours. In the Ivanovo days, the word went round persistently that the division would be withdrawn and transferred to Greece. As always, the rumour came to the front from the baggage train. The Sarge had bet the Kompania Truppenführer a barrel of Smolensk beer, and of course had lost. Whether he ever settled his bet with the sceptical Paliger, I never found out. At that time, an appeal was suddenly made to the troops to take part in the competition for the formation of a Frontkreuz. The front itself was to make recommendations for the order. It was to take the form of a cross. By small variations it would indicate whether the holder had served with the fighting troops or in the lines of communication, and how many years he had served. Commander Palig and I industriously drew up our proposals, mostly inspired by a bottle of cognac that the Oberleutnant donated from his own Sunday afternoon supply. There were many indications that the Russians were planning an offensive. They were firing registration fire on our positions, using targeted fire with premature detonation. Such shells exploded while still in the air. In that way, it was possible to assess the accuracy of the fire. From our side, a Focke-Wulf twin fuselage aircraft was in action over the enemy front lines. It was carrying out close reconnaissance by means of photography. The aircraft flew over in broad daylight and was only moderately troubled by enemy fire. The Russians were asleep at that time of day. Over Witsen I went with my platoon on outpost sentry duty. For the men, it meant crouching in the same small hole for 10 days and nights. From the outpost sentry position, the ground extending over to the enemy looked like a tightly stretched, flat tarpaulin. To lift a head above the parapet by day would have been suicidal. The position was excellently camouflaged, but the enemy was supposed not to discover it until the last minute. Flat trenches, scarcely knee-deep, connected the individual machine gun and foxholes of the Eigelstellung. The movement of a man in the daytime, even if he ducked down, could not be camouflaged. To get to such a foxhole was only possible by creeping or crawling along on your belly. Of the 24-hour period, only 4 or 5 gave sufficient darkness to be able to stretch our legs and move our limbs. During those hours, the units bringing food came up to the lines with rations and post for the men on the line. There was no water for washing. Washing and shaving were impossible. We had to clean our teeth with coffee. In a 2x 2-meter hole in the ground, as deep as a man's height, was my command post. It was covered with a layer of beams. Over the entrance was fixed the end of a wire by means of which a T-mine, 20 meters from the Eigelstellung in the direction of the enemy, could be set off. On Whit Sunday night, it was as if the Holy Ghost was truly appearing to us. On the stroke of midnight, a considerable barrage rumbled off, covering the lines of the 1st and 2nd battalions directly behind us and to the right of us. Multiple mortars, called Stalin organs, also joined in. It was a fascinating sight every time the 24 or 42 shells hit, spraying fire. By then it was clear that an attack on the sentry outpost was imminent. Whether it would be my post or that of the 3rd Battalion placed to one side was not yet clear. Meanwhile, the sound of tanks was suddenly to be heard. That indicated the Russians intended to attack the neighbouring position. The next night, we learned that in fighting off the attack, poor Popovsky got shot in the lung, but had been brought back to the rear in time and otherwise was well. It was said to have been a whole battalion. His platoon had borne itself bravely, but still had all kinds of casualties and lost 1 wounded man as a prisoner. When the Russians had got hold of him, they withdrew, together with the tanks. After almost 4 weeks at the front, I at last got some post from home, but there was nothing from father in France. Rudy was waiting to be called up, having been accepted into the Panzer Corps Hermann Göring, which made him really proud. Amusingly, he described the chaos in the school. No one in his class wanted to learn any more, but only play truant and, with their school-leaving certificate in their pockets, go to join up. Something that he had not told me before was that in February some trains with remnants of the 6th Army had passed through Stockerau and had stopped. But that was quite something, a battlefield taken all together, so to speak. Ruins, destroyed tanks, guns, horses and soldiers, and among them the straw everywhere, which gave the whole thing even more of a sense of doom. One night, the comforting petroleum lamp in my bunker could have caused a disaster. A platoon runner had inadvertently bumped into it and knocked it over. The overflowing petrol was soon caught by the flame, which spread out over the little table. We had trouble getting the boxes full of ammunition safely out of the bunker, including the box that served me as a pillow, while at the same time extinguishing the fire. Unfortunately, my fountain pen, a confirmation present, fell victim to the flames. On the night of 23-24 June, the battalion was unexpectedly relieved by a battalion from 461 and moved into the Nemes sector. The division was shifted a battalion width to the right, with us thus becoming the right-hand linking battalion. The march of only 10 km did everyone good. To be moving, despite the pack and large amount of ammunition that had to be carried, was a refreshing change. The new sector was excellently constructed. The bunkers were deep in the ground and were covered with roofs of thick beams. There were many machine gun and rifle positions, all correctly placed. The trench was as deep as a man's height. Only the barbed wire obstacles were incomplete. A road, overgrown with grass, to the remnants of the village of Nemes, passed through the main line of Resistance in the middle of the company sector. In the middle of my platoon sector was a 50-metre wide area of woodland, with the trench at the forward edge. Tall spruce trees, together with lower undergrowth and patches of grass in between, made the landscape look more like an English park than something you would have suspected to be in the heart of Russia. The disadvantage of the sector was a right-angled field, beginning 50 metres in front of the trench. It then extended at that width some 200 metres towards the enemy. On the farther edge of the right angle there used to be sentry outposts, but they were withdrawn, because at night they were too much at risk. Whole companies could have slipped into the brush. For that reason, every night, reconnaissance patrols had to go out to check the area. One night, when I had once again gone round the field, I ascertained that the Russians had settled themselves in the foxholes of our earlier outposts. As we reached our barbed wire on the way back, the Russians mounted a machine gun attack on the passage through the minefield and through the barbed wire. Evidently, they had been observing us slipping through the wire, for the heavy machine guns, which they must have fixed on the target during the daytime, fired with pinpoint accuracy. We were not able to press ourselves close enough to the ground until the attack was at last over. After calm had returned, and we had taken a long jump into the trenches, the runner Grimmig said that it would have been the right time to get a Heimatschuss by raising your hand. He had missed the chance yet again. Grimmig was a Gerhard Hauptmann-type figure who actually did have a grim expression, but was full of native wit, goodness, loyalty and courage. The humorous talk of a Heimatschuss was a manifestation of the so-called innerer Schweinehund. The Prussian army creation was so splendid because it had such insight into the character of even the simplest man. My kind Aunt Lotta sent me a whole lot of literature in small Feldpost editions. Apparently, hovering in front of her eyes were pictures of the trench Roman Tycism of the First World War, the good fathers with their front-line beards, giving themselves to edifying reading by the flicker of a Hindenburg lantern. So, as not to upset her, I thanked her effusively, but sent the little books straight home. Certainly, I would have had time for reading, but I did not have the necessary calm. The impressions of life at the front were still too new and too various, and life in the trenches, even in trench warfare, were too exciting for me to be able to immerse myself in reading. Much time was taken up in writing. There was Mother, who formed the central core of the family, and Father in France. Rudy, it is true, was still at home, but I wrote separately to tell him things that I could not, nor would not, write to Mother, so as not to worry her. But there were also friends, and finally, the girl. My affection was then fixed upon the Skorpilmedi. However, she had soon turned her affections away from me, again, even though I still carried a candle for her. I shall give a short account of the Skorpil family, with whose son, Erhard, I went to school. Erhard and his elder brother Hannibal were both killed in action with the Waffen-SS. The husband of the eldest daughter was an Oberleutnant in the Stockerau cavalry. In 1941 he was wounded and fell into the hands of the Russians and murdered in an atrocious way. It became known through his comrades, and the whole town knew of it. All 5 Skorpil children were good-looking. Elfrida, the youngest, was blonde and blue-eyed like the others, and with her long, thick hair was the picture of feminine grace. She was artistic, wrote calligraphy, and played the violin. At that time she did not know whether she should go to the Academy of Music or the Academy of Art. She later became a painter. During our nightly work on the barbed wire, we suffered many casualties from mortar fire. We worked on setting up Spanish Arita and tripwires. Accelerated completion of the work had been ordered because of the expected enemy summer offensive. We also had to provide greater security against assault and the capture of troops. The word was that specially trained Russians had been recently creeping through the lines to capture prisoners alive. At least 10 men had to work at the same time at any one place, it was said. If not, the enemy would grab one or other of them as they were stretching the wire. The roof of my bunker, with its 3 layers of beams, 1.2 meters thick in total, gave enough protection to be able to sleep in peace. A cannon stove, a nailed-together little table and 2 birchwood stools completed the day room. Behind a stretched piece of thin sacking were the bunks. The current state of trench technology was also displayed in the construction of the wooden beds. As well as the usual planks, which had the advantage that you lay level, there was also the wire bed, which bore some similarity to a hammock. Particularly nice was my bed of young birch trunks, which dipped way under my weight and feathered like a mattress. Sometimes, when I lay down to sleep after dawn had broken, I even allowed myself the luxury of taking my boots off in order to enjoy my feathery bed even more. Trench culture also flowered in other ways. On the table in front of the bunker window, situated on the back wall of the bunker, 1.5 meters underground, in front of a light shaft 0.5 meter square, Mehdi's picture was resplendent. A specialist had coloured it by hand, mounted it in a birch frame and covered it with cellophane instead of glass. Nickel, the platoon medic, gave me a homemade watch hanger. It consisted of a star shell cartridge filed off flat on the floor, the edges of which had been made jagged and bent round the photograph. But from time to time the quiet life in the bunker was interrupted. Once the Russians must have seen smoke. They fired exactly 75 shots from a Ratchbomb onto the bunker. The shots were all on target. 2 of them scored direct hits on the bunker, but luckily did not hurt us. The Nima's position had the advantage that you could get from the rear up to the most forward trenches without being seen by the enemy. Thanks to that, a warm lunch was actually able to be brought forward at lunchtime. But the Russians must have got wind of the time when food was distributed. On 2 days in succession, they signalled with pinpoint accuracy with a mortar. The lunchtime had actually been put back an hour, from 12:30 p.m. to 1:30 p.m. While the soup was pouring into the dishes, up above there was the glug of the mortar firing. Plop, 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 gluck. For the men who had brought the food, who had already had their portions, the interruption was doubly unpleasant, because with the full canteens in their hands, they were additionally hindered in taking cover. If they had spilled any food, they would have had a rough welcome from their comrades. Thus it seemed to be a fact that the Russians were listening in to our field telephone conversations by means of earth lines. The listening lines were nothing more than wires fixed into the earth by an iron rod. They were brought up as close as possible to the line to which they were to listen in, that is, as close as possible to our trenches. At the other end crouched a Russian, listening in on his listening set. Despite the fact that code names were constantly changed, for instance I was Rucksack for the first week in July, the listener must have been able to learn enough from the conversations to which he listened. More than anything, the tone of military respect could not be hidden. It was true that you were supposed to leave out service ranks, but habit and drill often made you embarrassed when, instead of Jawohl, Herr Major, you were supposed to answer with a straight civilian Ja or Nein. If the Russian could hear clearly and understood German well, he could soon draw his conclusions from the unabatedly obedient tone of the one participant in the conversation and the commanding tone of the other. One night I tripped over a wire in the area in front of the lines. Shocked, I thought at first that an S-mine laid by us had had a Russian line attached to it. It could have gone sky high together with me. But, thank God, that was not the case. It must obviously have been a listening wire. We reeled it gently in, which was not an easy job with a total length of 600 metres of wire. Particularly at the start you could feel resistance. Perhaps a listener was sitting at the other end. As Grimmig said, the eyes must have popped out of his head when his listening set began to move. On the night of 5-6 July, a battalion from our neighbouring division attacked the ascension heights that lay in front of their sector. The attack took place after 10 minutes preparatory fire. Nemes in particular was fully covered, with 80 Dugeschosse, the mysterious devices I had seen from a distance a few days previously near to the battalion command post. They looked like angled wooden frames resembling easels, half the height of a man. The projectiles were ignited like rockets, and when they were fired gave a loud screaming sound. The success of the operation must in any event have been nil. Through the regiment we heard that, of the total of 8 men in the Russian outpost on the heights, only a single man had been captured. He was an 18-year-old Uzbek who could not speak Russian. The nearest interpreter for Uzbek was at Army HQ. The interpreter thought that the lad was feeble-minded, since he was not even able to say when he came into the position, nor did he say to which unit he belonged. Perhaps he decided not to say. The one subordinate with whom I had problems was Unteroffizier Brinkmann, leader of the 8th section. He did not keep his trench in order. Sometimes a duckboard was not mended, or a piece of camouflage or cover was not put right, despite the fact that I had complained about it. Those were the little things which made Prussia great. Brinkmann was a watersider with the walk and the look of a seaman who used to smoke his pipe reflectively. I did not dislike him, but I had obviously not handled him properly. I had a good understanding with the Silesians and Sudeten Germans. However, I just did not have that understanding with Brinkmann. Perhaps I was too young for him. In 1943, a lot was already being said about the new weapons that were supposed to decide the war, but they were taking a long time to come. The MG-42, which the Russians called the electric, and of which there were a few in the company, was only a modest foretaste. Certainly, compared to the MG-34, it was a considerable improvement. The rate of fire was markedly higher, and it had hardly any recoil. So there were many sarcastic remarks and mischievous jokes when at that time we received a mitrailleuse, a French machine gun from the First World War. The monster was several times heavier and also more complicated to operate than our own machine guns. The only thing fine about it was the shining golden brass handle. The machine gun had cartridge packs of 20 rounds each. When you inserted them and pressed the trigger, it went tack, 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 and pounded away in a leisurely fashion out into the world. On Sundays the food was better, and there was even a small ration of schnapps. It was simple hooch, often sweetened with artificial honey. When the commander had been drinking, in the afternoon he ordered me to the company bunker. Part of the equipment of the company troops was a field wireless receiver, usually carried on the back. It was possible to listen on Sunday afternoons to the popular Volkskonzert. Requests from the front were featured on it. As I was missing music very much, on those visits to the company command post, I felt myself to be on a higher cultural level. Oberleutnant Henschel enjoyed Sunday as much as he could by having his horse brought with the food vehicle. He rode to the baggage area, going into the sauna there and in that way having a nice day on the lines of communication. Of course, it was quite right and proper if the commander went to the rear now and again, except that things did not go too smoothly for the workmen and clerks. He had cognac sent up from the canteen stock for Patij and me, and that made us very merry. One time Patij and I had a bit of a binge together, which led us to be giddy enough to walk up and down, with no cover, outside the trench along the parapet as if on an esplanade. It set a bad example to everyone and was against all orders. Obviously the Russians must have been drunk too, or at least asleep, because they let slip the chance of some competition shooting, with us as two targets. As the high point of the lark, towards evening, we fired off red and green flares. Red usually meant defensive fire, enemy attack, and green lift artillery fire. Of course the flares had been noticed, and we had a hard time pacifying the questioners on the other end of the line. To this day I am still amazed that we got away with it. A letter from father at the beginning of July read, "Now I am able at least to imagine a little of your daily and nightly life. Your description reminds me very much of my own experiences from 1915 to 1918. A quiet position is a first prize, only I think that especially in Russia you will never be able to rely on it staying that way. Build a wall around us so that the enemy will look at it in horror. What your former section leader said, that a decent soldier always carries his field hymn book in his breast pocket, is something I shall tell to some people here. Here in the West, things are not easy. In most cases, I am dealing with really indolent sensualists for whom things are going far too well for them to think of anything serious. If my health would stand it, I would far rather be serving in the East than here."